According to the National Transportation Safety Board, sleepy truckers are responsible for 1,000 deaths a year. In second place, O.J. Simpson at 2 deaths a year. It was revealed this week that defense lawyer Johnny Cochran once abused his first wife. In his defense, Cochran said, "Hey, at least I didn't kill her like some people I know." Tomorrow, Judge Lance Ito will take O.J. and the jury on a tour of the now famous crime scene. For the jury, it will be their first look at the actual location. Of course, for O.J., it will be just a case of been there, done that. Judge Lance Ito was happy with the jurors' field trip to the crime scene last week. It went off without a hitch, said Ito. Not one murder.
Good morning. It is Saturday, December the 24th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have demotivation, who wrote it, no predictions, giving your children a head start, no free lunch, and North Virginia legal advice, and Jinx, chapter 23. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, biblical principles to defeat the devil for December 23rd. Let wisdom and knowledge be my stability and strength of salvation, and the fear of the Lord my treasure. You have filled me with your spirit, in wisdom and understanding, in knowledge and all manner of workmanship. Happy are your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Amen. And that was the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for December 23rd.
Ready, begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch.
The way to maximize production is to maximize the incentives to production. And the way to do that,
as the modern world has discovered, is through the system known as capitalism, the system of private property, free markets, and free enterprise. Henry Hazlitt. The most successful of economic ideas are ones that understand incentives, play into incentives, reject disincentives, and seek systems that broadly incentivize what we want in our socioeconomic order. Hazlitt understood this as well as any economist in the last 200 years. Once you can say the most basic of economic truisms, we want more production, you can easily consider what produces the incentive for production. That incentive is the profit motive, embedded in the free enterprise system.
And that was There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Listening to Buck-Sexton and Company on 1150 here, and exactly what I was talking about. So the omnibus bill had passed in the Senate. It's over in the House, farting around. So he has this Republican House member on. I don't know his name. I don't care. But he has the House member on, and this Republican is telling him, oh, yes, well, the Senate is the place where all good ideas go to die. And he's bragging about how years ago they got this done and that done in the omnibus bill, and then they had problems with the Senate because they would send a bill over to the Senate, and the Senate would then, the Murkowski and Collins in the Senate would kill it. And so all that kind of thing, and that the bad guys are in the Senate, and yabba. And so what is he doing is he is, again, the guy that comes out and cools off the marks, right? It's because you have a con job, and when people get conned, they get pissed off. And then they want to go and call the police, and they want to go maybe sue or whatever. The guy that's left behind to cool off the marks is to calm them down, insist there's nothing that they can do. Why bother? Just move along, right? Just move on. Let's just move on and skip the whole thing and forget about it. And that's what he's here to do. This guy that's on Sexton's show, this Republican, he wants to, basically tell, and he does it by sympathizing. Hey, I'm on your side. That's the message from all these Republicans that these talk shows have on their show, that come on to say, my colleagues really suck. They're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. They sold us out. They like to use that phrase. They sold us out, and it's outrageous. What is he doing? He's sympathizing with everybody, and what's the effect? Everybody instantly calms down. You lose the outrage. Nobody any longer wants to do anything. He also throws in the message that, well, there's nothing we can really do about it unless we have this, that, or the other. Impossible things happen. So unless we completely overturn the Senate and throw out all the Republicans and start all over again, which isn't going to happen. So he comes in, cools off the marks. Not only that, but then again, like I said, this is a butt-kissing session, or as I like to say, sucking the member of the member that they do, because that's all he was doing. Oh, we're so glad to have you here. We're so glad you're on our show. And then not only is he going to do that, but next week he's turning over the mic to this fool instead of giving somebody a worthy up-and-coming conservative talk show host, somebody with good voice. No, he gives it to a Republican House member who is going to use this time next week for free airtime so he can increase his visibility, increase his name recognition. It's free campaign time on national radio. Okay, so this guy can get a head start on his political campaign for free. So again, we keep asking ourselves, why don't things change? Number one, they don't change because of these our talk show hosts, these people that we so many of us worship and think are like God or something. Oh, you're so wonderful, are busy being complicit in selling us out by putting these boobs on the radio in the first place, and then letting them substitute. Sean Hannity does this all the time. There's some old man from Texas that he puts on to sub for him, And so giving them free airtime. They don't give any airtime to any of the competitors. They don't get free airtime, but the people that have $1 million war chests, the office holders, they get free airtime. How does that make any sense? It doesn't. And then is it that these talk show hosts can sit here and then whine and complain that nothing ever changes, and whine and complain that nobody's motivated? Well, gee, Mr. Talk Show host, maybe it's because you're demotivating everybody. Back in a minute. Thank you. So another interesting thing about this bill, the omnibus spending bill that I remember Rand Paul was talking about, and everybody's been talking about. Oh, it's 4,000 pages long. Lately, it's 4,600 pages long. Nobody's read it. Nobody's even read the bill. They just dump it on us. Well, let me ask you a question. If nobody's read it, who wrote it? Back in a minute. So thank you. I'm listening to Clay Travis, I guess is his name, because Buck Sexton and Clay Travis, Sexton and Travis or whatever, on 1150. Those are the two guys that took over for Rush Limbaugh. And so Buck is off, I guess, on vacation, and so I guess Clay next week will be off on vacation. But so Clay is talking about his predictions, and he's predicting that. It doesn't matter. This is what the Republicans do all the time because they're scared and stupid. They think that smart is making predictions. No, it isn't. Smart is making value judgments. The problem with making predictions is that it lacks value. There's no value in it because he was made sure to let the audience know he was neutral. He said he told everybody who he thought was going to be the nominee in 2024 for the Republican Party. Excuse me. But he did not come out and say, he did not come out and endorse the person. He says, that doesn't mean I'm going to vote for him. Doesn't say who I'm going to vote for. And again, he's scared. He has taken a lesson from Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck came out against Donald Trump vehemently. He came out and threatened to commit suicide. He was so adamant about being anti-Trump, and he lost half of his audience. He almost went out of business. He basically had to start over. And every talk show host in this country's learned that lesson, the Trump lesson. You go against Donald Trump at your own peril. So he does it out of fear. But in any case, what he should be doing is making a value judgment, not saying who he predicts will be, but who should be. Okay, that's the thing to do. That's the smart thing to do, is and then he bragged, of course, about all of his predictions. Well, I predicted this and it happened and blah, blah. Who cares? It's value free. You want to know one of the reasons that this country is in the moral state that it is because nobody will make value statements and talk about what should happen, what should be, etc. So let me get to it. Who should be the nominee for the 2024 presidential election for the Republicans? It should be, if it comes down to Donald Trump, and no, it doesn't matter. I don't care. Who it should be is Donald Trump, period. Ron DeSantis, in my opinion, has simply aped Donald Trump. Him and his handlers have looked at Donald Trump and said, you know what? If Donald Trump can do that, we can do that too. So he simply copied him. Ron DeSantis made promises and kept them, just like Donald Trump did. This is part of what makes Donald Trump such a good president and leader, is that there are people that are actually following him. They're taking notes, and they're trying to do the same things he's doing. Now, there's still people in the party that want to resist, like Chris Christie. But so what? He'll be, he'll be left behind. But anyways, so he is learning from the master. And but it is Donald Trump, because who deserves to be in office is who should be in office is who deserves to be in office. How do you know who deserves? You look at their track record. Donald Trump, of those two candidates, As a matter of fact, of any Republican potential candidate, is the only one with presidential experience and good presidential experience. He made promises and kept them. He did the right things at the right time for the right reason. That's why Donald Trump should be the presidential nominee for the Republican Party in 2024. Back in a minute. Thank you. And good old Clay, again, is at it again. Now he's talking about how to raise your kids so that they can be successful. He says, he says self-reliance. And immediately when I heard self-reliance, a little alarm went off in my head. And I thought, wait a minute. So he's wrong about this. And then he says, basically, you have to not have children until you're 25. Now, he said there's three things that you have to do. I think complete high school and not have children until you're 25. And then he contradicted himself. And he says, I know there's some of you out there that have had kids when you were 21 or something. That's okay. Well, if it's okay, then why are you advising people to have wait till 25 to have their kids? It's either okay or it's not okay. So he contradicts himself. And when he does that, nobody's paying attention to him anymore. People are just tuning out. This is what that you need to do. If you're going to you want to do right by your children, number one, get married. Number two, stay married. Number three, go to Mass. Take your kids to church. Go to Mass every Sunday, if not more frequently. If you want to make sure that your children are well grounded morally, take them to Mass. If you want to make sure that they get a good education, put them in a Catholic school. Even though you're going to have to spend money for it, even though it's probably going to be fairly expensive, that's what you should do. Those are the four things you should do for your child if you want to give them a good head start in life. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit more of the Northern Virginia legal advice.
Hi, folks. This is Scott Nolan. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Northern Virginia, and I'm going to talk to you about when you must identify yourself to the police, when you must provide them with some form of identification. I have a client who was just walking down the street. Unbeknownst to her, she was passing by a scene of a crime, I guess, and some police officers emerged from a building and asked her for her license. Now, no, she wasn't driving, she was just walking down the street. She was not certain whether or not she had to provide the license. And she asked them, do I have to give you my license? They said, ma'am, would you please let us see your license? Now, that's a clue. If you had to, they would tell you you have to. She decided she wasn't going to do it. She said, no, I'm not going to give you my identification. They said, well, if you're not guilty, why wouldn't you tell us your name? And she said, because I don't like the police. And they let her go. What else could they do? So, let's talk about when you have to and when you don't have to. There are two important cases or times in Virginia where you must provide a license. Number one, when you're driving a vehicle, if a police officer stops you, you must provide them with your license and your registration. Number two, if you're going to board an airplane, that's it. Those are the only times in Virginia you are required to identify yourselves. So there's several different instances that I want to talk about the particulars of. And the first is important because it's different in Virginia than in many other states. And that's what we call a consensual encounter. That is, you're just walking along and a police officer comes up to you and says, hey, could I have a word with you? And there's nothing forceful about it. You're not under arrest. You're not being detained. As far as you know, the officer's not investigating you for anything. And the law says that you are there by your own consent. Now, under those circumstances, you have no requirement to provide your identification, to tell the officer anything. you are perfectly free to turn around and walk away and say nothing. And that's exactly what I advise you to do. Now, that is only the law in about half the states. 24 states in this country have laws that say you must provide your identification when stopped by the police. Now, they usually have some sort of qualification, like only when the police have reasonable belief that you are involved with a crime or blah, blah, blah. But how do you know whether they have that reasonable belief? And the law says you don't get to decide. They do. So Texas is one of the states where that's legal, and the United States Supreme Court recently upheld a law in Texas saying that the police could do that. They can force you in a consensual encounter to provide your identification. And that's true, again, in about half the states. Now, I am not a Texas attorney, but I do believe that that's a terrible precedent. It's a terrible decision on the part of the court. It is, in my view, patently unconstitutional and is violative of our rights to privacy as citizens. However, they're the Supreme Court. I'm not. Now you know. In Virginia, you have no such requirement. Such laws come up, or proposals for such laws come up, almost every couple of years. Somebody proposes it, somebody who thinks they're going to do the police a favor, when in fact it should be the citizenry that they're helping out. And thank God, so far, the legislature has always declined to enact such a law. Let's hope it keeps up. All right, so what is the next type of encounter? The next type of encounter is not so consensual. It's what's known under the law as a Terry stop, from the Supreme Court case of Terry v. Ohio. And that's when the police come up to you, and they are investigating a crime, and it's quite clear that they are, and they have done what's known as an investigatory detention. That is to say, you're not under arrest, but you're not free to leave, which is, of course, a complete legal lie. There's no other words for that. Courts know it, you know it, police know it, lawyers know it. We all know it's a lie, but the courts are going to stick to it anyway. So when you're in that situation where the officer wants to talk to you and you're not free to leave, but you're not technically under arrest, are you required to identify yourself? And again, the answer, at least in Virginia, is no. There is no requirement to identify yourself. Now, let me be clear. You absolutely cannot lie to the police. You cannot say, I'm somebody else. It happens all the time. I represent people almost every week who have misidentified themselves to the police. It's a dumb idea. Don't do that. They're going to figure it out. However, you are not required to give them your actual identity. All right, so maybe the most contentious issue is, what about when the police actually have you under arrest? Do you have to tell them your name when you're under arrest? Well, I did some digging on this. I did some investigation because the law wasn't clear, at least not to me, and it wasn't clear to any attorney I spoke to. But I found again and again and again on the web assurances that if you're under arrest, you absolutely have to identify yourself. Well, guess what? It ain't so. The law does not exist in Virginia. There's no case law on that, and there's no statute that says you have to identify yourself when you're arrested. I think it'll be a very interesting case. I don't recommend that you go that route, but be aware that you have an absolute right under the Fifth Amendment to shut your mouth and keep it shut. You do not have to identify yourself to the police.
Thank you. And so, again, that was the Northern Virginia legal advice lawyer. And I wanted to comment on a couple of things that he was saying, is that he presented a few contradictions. And we've seen contradictions in the law frequently. You would think that if we live in a free society and that it's spelled out in the law what our freedoms are in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, that there wouldn't be any conflicts. There wouldn't be any contradictions. We wouldn't have conflicting court opinions, that anything that was a violation of our rights would be thrown out and everything else would be allowed to stand. But you heard him talking about a Supreme Court case. It was a bad decision in Texas, right? And then he was talking about something that was an absolute fiction. You don't actually have to do that. And I know that, you know that, the courts know that, but it's done that way anyhow. So where do we get these conflicts? Simple. As I've said before, we have in our society now, since about 1900 or so, the belief that's now become ingrained in our legal system, the idea that the government has rights. This is why I've said frequently, I'm the only true conservative in the United States today because I'm the only one that knows that the government has no rights. Okay, and that's where we get into conflict. So what we end up happening is when you go to court, is the court is asked to balance. Lots and lots of cases, the court is asked to balance the rights of the person versus now they don't refer to it as rights of the government. They refer to it as usually as a compelling interest, which is just a code word for rights. And the government has no rights. And we know this with absolute certainty, number one, from reading the Constitution, but we also know about this from criminal law. If the government gathers evidence against you and they do it illegally without a search warrant, etc., then that evidence is no good. It cannot be used against you in a court of law, even if it is evidence that would prove conclusively that you committed the crime in question. It's thrown out. Why? Because you have rights, and those rights are paramount. You have rights. The government has no rights. Authority, yes, limited. And responsibility, just enough authority to meet their responsibilities, but that's it. And that authority and that responsibility must give way to our rights. Remember, the government has no rights. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, chapter 23, I believe, from Jinx.
Chapter 23. The meeting that afternoon had been exciting. Progress was in the air, the feel of the chase. The pictorial bombardment by Jimmy Moser was judged, however early, the enlargements were not yet ready, to have been a smashing success. 70, Jimmy Moser exclaimed, negatives, had been got from the flashlight camera, and these were viewed on a small screen by 6 spectators. The 3 Americans, Rufus, Anthony, Blackford, Sir Gene, as they now called him at his urging, and Superintendent Roberts, plus a photographic technician with MI5. More, the technician 3 times said, might be discerned on the following day, after enlargement of the negatives was arranged. But in the meantime, one finding was conclusive. After hungrily examining the pictures of the silent co-resident, Blackford pronounced, in accents that didn't invite contradiction, that the other man in apartment 516 was indeed Henry, Bertram Oliver Heath. The other finding of interest made by the photographic technician was to the effect that he knew of no photographic assembly remotely like that which he now examined. He was eager, he said, for the session the next morning, with the negatives enlarged. Rufus suggested, in an aside to Blackford, that the American party might dine informally together for professional purposes, and Blackford, in a telephone call to James Street, arranged for cold beef and chicken, red wine and cheese, fruit and coffee. They sat around the living room outside Blackford's op-ox study. The strain of the afternoon's proceedings, the quiet but tense disagreement with the 2 Britishers on how to proceed, almost required that during the eating hour the compressed ensemble should give over a relaxing half-hour to irrelevancies. And so Blackford reminisced about his first meeting with Anthony Trust. He was a 17-year-old prefect at Grayburn College, Rufus, and we were all supposed to be frightened of prefects. But it took me a while to catch on. Trust began to recount the awe he felt on first meeting Rufus, and was joyously embarked on the intimidating briefing given him by his CIA training officer on the subject of what was all right and what was not all right in the company of Rufus, and about Rufus's spectacular achievements during the war, when Rufus interrupted. A raised hand, the shy but authoritative smile. No need to go into my background, Anthony. That much from Rufus was definitive. On to the next subject. Was there a subject contiguous to Rufus's mystique? Blackford elided into eccentricity as a universal phenomenon. They laughed together over some of the mannerisms of their British colleagues. Blackford. Sir Jean, have you noticed? A nose-picker. But he seems to think nose-picking becomes invisible. Blackford, contorting himself, gave a demonstration. If he bends his right arm behind his head to pick at his left nostril, and then later his left arm behind his head to pick at his right nostril, he figures this makes the whole maneuver socially invisible. Anthony laughed heartily. Rufus smiled. He enjoyed the banter, but left it to his young colleagues to practice it. Inevitably, the discussion turned serious. Professional agents of counterintelligence don't usually ask wide-eyed questions on the order of, "How do you suppose Bertram Heath became what he is?" But in a reflective frame of mind, Blackford now asked Rufus if he had gotten anything of universal application from his knowledge of the literature of communist apostates. I mean, learned anything from the defectors beyond what we all know from reading their books, which I call the God that failed books. Rufus said that, however perverse, it was still a form of idealism that kept many communists in the system. He cited the comment made by an Englishman within the KGB to a British mole who had given his colleague to read an account of what the communists had done to destroy Warsaw. After reading the book, Rufus related, he said words to this effect, that there were two alternatives facing Western communists. The first is to say, we were wrong, we'll chuck it all, and go back to the bourgeois world even though we know they haven't changed. The other is to acknowledge that human nature affects also the leadership of the communist movement, and that there will be purge trials and Nazi-Soviet pacts and Warsaw uprisings, but that also one day there will be a dream realized. He said he was choosing the second alternative. With that kind of thinking, one doesn't argue. "What do you do?" Blackford asked. "You wait? You fight?" Rufus paused and added quietly, "And you pray." Rufus stood up and walked toward the coffee pot. "Meanwhile, we have the problem of the Brits." That problem, which had been discussed endlessly during the afternoon, had to do with how to proceed on the matter of apartment 516. Sir Jean and Roberts were emphatic in recommending instant penetration with search and arrest warrants. Rufus had argued for a delay. His problem was in making his case for the delay without divulging his most valuable secret, namely the mole within the walls of the Kremlin, now relaying vital information via Mr. Mussolini. Mussolini's bulletins might prompt action by Washington, the success of which would depend on Washington-London communications being regularly intercepted by Moscow. Rufus had told neither Truss nor Blackford about Mr. Mussolini, and would not do so unless it proved necessary, so his arguments against immediate entry into apartment 516 were hard to sustain, whether talking with the British or with his own colleagues. But at least with the latter he could say some things he couldn't say to his British counterparts, and now he did so. "I was not able with the British to go as far as I'd have liked in explaining why we want to consult other factors in deciding when to abort apartment 516. They would ask, what other factors? I would be put in the position of saying other factors we elect not to tell you about at this point. To you I can say merely that there are other factors which you do not know about." Trust said, "This is their country, Rufus, and British laws have been broken. It's their call, isn't it?" "Yes, it is. But we have leverage, and we will use it. The two big actors in this episode are both British. The damage was done primarily to Americans. Something can be got out of that, and they need our technical information. But it is getting late," Rufus said, picking up his hat and umbrella, "and we have an engagement tomorrow." He walked to the door. "Good night, gentlemen." Blackford brought out a bottle of scotch. Anthony leaned back in his chair and said, "I got to admit, Black, my instincts are for a quick kill. Get in there, put an end to the business, haul him in, examine the spook. What do you think?" "My instincts," Blackford said, standing now in his shirt sleeves, his back to the gas fire, and speaking with unwonted solemnity, "are to apply pressure through Henry. Henry, Bertram Oliver Heath, the young sadist of Winchester, Heath, the sycophantic lover of Fleetwood. Granted, we don't know whether their relations went in that direction. We know that kind of thing hasn't been exactly uncommon in Cambridge in the set that considers itself emancipated. Heath, the mistress beater. Heath, the man who led the 41 commandos with whom he trained, who trusted him to the gallows and then faked pictures of his own martyrdom. I'd like to go after him, but I confess that's in part because I don't much care what would happen to him if he didn't yield his secrets. Anthony Trust recognized in his old friend the uncompromising determination that he had experienced in Blackford once before. He contented himself to say, in accents studiedly unpatronizing, "Black, we're involved in a joint venture. Remember, what you feel about Heath can't govern the thinking behind that operation." Finishing his highball, Trust said, "Did you see the Daily Mail today about Queen Caroline at the Covent Garden opening? An American reporter leaned over the royal box and said, 'Ma'am, is it true there might be a summit conference? And if so, would you be willing to greet Premier Malenyenkov?' Well, of course, normally the Queen simply doesn't answer questions shouted out at her that way. But she turned in his direction, can you see it, Black, and said, 'I shall greet my horse Steadfast if he wins the Derby. Should I do less for Soviet leaders?' Bloody joy, that woman. But you know that from 1951. Yes, Blackford said. She is certainly something."
Thank you. And that was Hi Jinx, Chapter 23, back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. Until next time, remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.